Hello and welcome to the first webinar as part of this From Linear to Circular Open to All program. My name is Seb. I'm the part of the learning team here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where I've worked for around 6 years in various roles. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Colin Webster. Colin, who are you?
I'm Colin. We have met before, Seb. I'm part of the learning team at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as well. It's a real pleasure to be here in front of you for the start of this learning program. And it's also an equal thrill for me to see Seb sitting in front of what appears to be pictures of broccoli, Seb.
Pictures. This is actually 3D living moss wool. The designers in our office have come up with this ingenious idea for a background in a webinar room. Yeah, that's great.
Well,
Better than my living room wall, I suppose.
But we are here at the start of a 7-week online learning program. And the centerpiece, if you like, of the program are these 7 webinars that we'll run. But it's by no means the only thing that's holding this entire program together. You found out about this program and you've already accessed our Slack group. And that's where we're going to share with you lots of learning materials. So different videos you can watch every week, articles you can read, challenges that we'll set for you. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation learning team, comprising of the 2 of us, as well as our colleagues Clem and Ilmar, who are here today, and also Anna, who's taken a cheeky little holiday at the start of this program. We'll be in and about the Slack program, looking at your comments, looking at your posts, and commenting on them ourselves.
And so, yeah, do make sure that you have access to that Slack channel. If you've somehow snuck into it, or you've got to, you've lost the link. We've got a tiny URL on some of our slides, tiny.cc FL2C open. So make sure you access that. This is week 1 of a 7-week program, as Colin said, and today we're going to be starting with the conversation around which circular economy, which we're going to dive into in a bit more detail. But this is an interactive session. We want your participation. There'll be a few moments when we quite explicitly ask you to join in through some other sort of tools and devices. But obviously within Zoom, you have a couple of interaction points of us. There's the chat window, which is really there'll be a couple moments where we directly prompt you to put stuff in the chat window. And if you have technical problems or anything sort of clarification questions about the technical running of the session, do post in there. We'd say that with so many people on this webinar, that window can get very busy. And so if it's overwhelming, just turn it off and turn it back on again when we're directly asking for participation there. There is a Q&A box where you can post questions related to the content of this session. We know there are probably more questions than we can get to in this hour, but we will try and answer as many as possible, or maybe some of them will be answered later in the program. And we also try and tackle some of them in the community space over the course of the 7 weeks. So yeah, so this is just a bit of information about that community.
Right, and everyone should know this anyway. If you are really struggling, you can let us know in the chat window, and Ilma and Clem can help out there. But it is a very busy chat window, so we offer our apologies in advance if we can't quite get to everything. We want to show you the flow of what comes over the next 7 weeks then. And again, this is a document that's available in the Slack window, but we thought we'd have a quick chat about it right now. We are obviously at week 1, which is which circular economy, and Seb and I are going to take you through that in the next hour. And the weeks that follow, well, they're all spelled out there, and there's not really much benefit in me reading to you what you can read on the screen. But what we will have over the following 6 weeks is lots of expert guests, some from within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, some within our network as well, who can come and give you a perspective on the circular economy or a particular aspect of the circular economy as the weeks go by. And you may feel you have a particular expertise yourself in one area or the other, but I think what you'll find is even if you know nothing about, for example, farming in the circular economy, you'll find that session fascinating because every single week we've lined up a super guest.
Maybe one other thing, Colin, is that we also, in addition to these webinars, are hosting Friday recaps. So on a Friday morning UK time, 10 o'clock UK time, there'll be a group of people from the foundation team talking about what came up in that week's webinar, as well as reflecting on some of your responses in the community spaces. And the details for that will be on Slack in the channel Friday Reflections. So another interaction point of us if you wish to take it.
Now, talking of interaction, Seb, do you want to kick us off in our first interactive activity here?
It would be my absolute pleasure. So the instructions on the screen are fairly clear, hopefully. Basically, we want you to access this tool called Mentimeter. So if you go to the link menti.com, www.menti.com, it will prompt you for a code, which we put on the screen. And these first couple of questions we're going to walk you through are really trying to understand the baseline of where we are. We know we've got a lot of people who have quite a lot of experience and knowledge of the circular economy. So the first question you should be prompted with when you access this link, and let us know in the chat if that isn't the case, is a question about your knowledge of circular economy. How do you rate it? So if you can already start to respond to that, I'll let them responses come in a little bit longer, a little bit more, and then I'm going to...
Are they coming in, Seb? Because I know you're in the background there.
I'm going to show you, Colin. So yeah, so we've got a bit of a middle ground group. I think maybe you've allowed people to sit on the fence there a little bit, Colin, unfortunately. But obviously the goal of this program is very much to push you from wherever you are now, whether you think you've got basically zero knowledge, or even if you think you've got excellent knowledge, certainly if you think you've got good knowledge, to push you through the engagements with fellow participants on this program, through the engagements with the experts in the webinars, and through thinking about this topic to be able to push you further up this chain. So hopefully in week 7, we'll be able to ask the same question again, and we'll see the percentages have pushed further to the left-hand side of this diagram. Right, and now we have the bit of this that I didn't test prior to this session. Hopefully, what you should see now is the next question in Mentimeter. Let's see if that actually happens. Yeah, so it should prompt you, if not, to say presenter has changed slides and then go to slide. And if that's the case, the question you'll be seeing is, what are the 3 words that come to mind when you think of circular economy? And if you enter those 3 words, that will populate. And again, I've hidden, there was one unfortunate internal experiment with this where we actually showed this populating live, and it does tend to influence people's results if they can see what other people are submitting earlier. So I'll allow a few people to start to populate this diagram. What comes to mind for you, Colin, when you think of circular economy?
Goodness me, you didn't tell me you were going to ask me that, Seb. Well, I think that's what we're going to talk about in the next hour, basically. So I don't want to give my hand away too soon. So I'm actually not going to answer your question.
Wow, what a great guest you are. Here's what's come to mind. Firstly, you can see there's quite a lot has come to mind for our guests. Interestingly, sustainability, sustainable, zero waste, reduce, recycling, future resources, regenerative is starting to gain some traction in the middle there.
Design in there quite prominently too.
Yeah.
Innovation, design.
Cradle to cradle. Yeah. Closed loop. No massive surprises. I think we're going to talk about sustainability and sustainable later, and it'll be good to get your responses to our point of view on that subject, the relationship between circular economy and sustainability. An understandable association for you to have at this point. I'm going to prompt you. Hopefully you should be seeing now the next slide. Again, it may just flag up on the screen and say presenter switch slides. This time you're going to be prompted to respond on a scale of, I think it's 1 to 5 on 3 statements. The first statement is the purpose of a circular economy is to reduce waste. The second statement is the circular economy is another term for sustainability, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the circular economy gives businesses a competitive advantage. So let's see. We'll give that a few moments to iterate. And I think this final exercise, Colin, is starting to hint at the title of this webinar. Which circular economy? Because as the circular economy gains prominence, of course, it's defined in different ways. It gets used as a term for different purposes, and people come away with different interpretations of it, which is natural and not a criticism. But these spectrums start to speak about where do you sit, or what's your current understanding or thinking around this terminology. Let's share these incoming results.
Wow.
So we can see very strong agreement with the purpose of a circular economy is to reduce waste. A middling score for another term of sustainability. I hope it wasn't my previous comment that steered people in that direction.
But sustainability or sustainable was, I think, the most prominent word in the word cloud.
Yes.
It was interesting to see it's just sitting in the middle right now.
Yeah. Very strong agreement with the circular economy gives businesses a competitive advantage. We know from the registrations on this series that there's a heavy degree of interest in the business side of this, the sort of, the direction for the future of the economy.
Now, Seb, do you think if we'd run this poll even just a few years ago, the results would be different to what we're seeing right now?
I think, I think that's a really good question, Colin. I think that certainly in the case of the clarity around the competitive advantage for businesses has been strengthening all the time, and it's also been helped by a number of very large businesses coming out with circular economy strategies, and obviously countries and cities coming out with roadmaps. Interestingly, I wonder if the circular economy is another term for sustainability is actually coming down compared to where we were. Well, you and I've worked at the foundation for 6 years, you even longer. It was very hard effort in the early days of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to be clear that there was some difference or some thinking that was somehow distinct between those two terms, which this poll suggests that there's some genuine uncertainty amongst the group that we have on this webinar now.
Yeah, and I would have expected there to be more of an alignment with the term sustainability in the way we saw it in the word cloud. But I guess we'll talk a bit more about that as we go on. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I disagree. The circular economy is not another term for sustainability as far as I conceive of the two terms. But everyone's different, of course, and no one's opinion is right, no one's is wrong. And I think that's a key thing to say about what we're about to present and what we're about to discuss, is that we are going to express our own individual opinions and the opinions in some cases of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But that's not to say that what we say is right, and if you disagree with us, you are wrong. Certainly not that case, but we will have a few strong opinions along the way, I think, Seb.
Hopefully, that's exactly what we're looking for, and that's a big purpose of this program. So don't be afraid to state a strong opinion, whether it's in the Slack channel or in challenge to Colin or I during this webinar.
Because Seb does enjoy a good fight. Right, so let's kick off. We're going to kick off with a quote, actually.
A verbal fight.
True, yes. I'm going to start by putting a quote up on the screen. He says, as if he's able to do that nice and easy. There it is there from ING. So the quote there is quite clear. Circular economy is a way of causing less environmental harm. This is a report that ING recently published. And I've actually only skimmed the report, to be honest, but there seems to be quite a lot in there that I would agree with. But I don't agree with this quote. And I just wonder, Seb, before I say why, what's your perspective on this quote and its relation to circular economy?
I think for me, environmental benefits are a benefit that comes out of operating the economy as a circular economy, just as environmental damage is a consequence of operating the economy the way we do today. And what I mean by that is, and in some ways, I see sustainability also as an outcome of doing the circular economy well and operating the economic model fundamentally differently versus the intention of operating the model that way.
I see. So for you, this statement is about the fundamental purpose of running a circular economy. ING, as far as you're concerned, are saying we do this in order to cause less harm environmentally.
Yes.
Whereas you would run a circular economy in order to.
So for me, the circular economy is a way of creating an economy that can work in the long term and deliver benefits to people, businesses, and of course the environment.
So my take on this one is I agree with the way you've just summed it up, but for me, I think you've contradicted yourself a little because the way you just described it, you do have environment up there as a goal, albeit one of three as opposed to the number one. But I think the mindset here is wrong. I don't think we should be aiming to cause less environmental harm. I think you're setting yourself up for a loser from the outset if what you plan to do is to be less bad than you currently are. As some wit once put it, if someone says to you, I only beat my wife 5 nights a week instead of 7 nights a week these days, you're still doing a bad thing. And if our goal is to create a better world, environmentally speaking, as well as socially, economically, then surely we should be aiming to improve the situation to such an extent that we can regenerate the planet. And regenerate, I noticed in the word cloud, was actually quite prominent. So I think there'd be quite a few people with me on that.
And I think what you're touching on as well, Colin, is why language is, and it's going to be a key theme within this webinar, I guess, is why we focus quite intensely on language. When we talk about causing less harm, it really changes the options and the mindset you have versus how do we create benefits and positive impacts? What are the right things to do versus how do we mitigate against some of the bad things of all the bad outcomes of the things we do?
Super. Now, our colleagues are in the chat windows and looking at the Q&A, and soon we'll go to Clem, who will give us a few insights from what you've been saying. So please bring things to their attention, and we'll make sure we hear from Clem later on. But we're going to go to another picture just now, as I did a bit of an image search around the circular economy and terms that are often associated with it, because I thought these would be good talking points for us to discuss which circular economy. And the first one I came up with was this beautifully drawn selection of images here, found on a website which was proposing what you and I could do differently in order to, I suppose, create a better planet. And Seb, I know you particularly wanted to talk about this, consumer behavior.
Yeah, so I mean, this comes from a mindset of obviously a very positive mindset of thinking about what can individuals do. For me, the challenge of consumer, I almost feel like consumers get a really bad time, because if you think about the trillions of materials and investment that goes into creating the products that, many of the products that we have on this slide here, the effort that goes into making them, and then the effort that goes into distributing them, getting them to the end user. And then very often our solution is to say, well, the problem here is that person at the end has to work out exactly what the right thing is to buy in this complex world of all different material, of all different product options they have. That person needs to work out exactly what they need to do with that product or material next in order to make sure that it doesn't become waste. And it's really hard work. And even for people like you and I who maybe work in this space, knowing what the right thing to do with a piece of plastic packaging, for example, is extremely context specific firstly, but just quite challenging because it's not as clear as the story might be. And so this is obviously there are things that you as a consumer, and I also have to say I take offense to the word consumer. I don't consume this jumper. That's almost a very convenient word in a linear economy where we're talking about take, make, waste, to talk about the idea that we consume this, talking about the importance of language, because it suggests that it's gone, when in fact it hasn't gone. It's become waste. I use this for a certain amount of time, and then I need something else to happen to it afterwards. And that system should be designed, that product should be designed so that it's very hard for me to make a bad choice with this versus me having to have all the knowledge and insights to make the right choices. So I think consumers or customers or users get a really hard time in a lot of our meta narratives about how we should be trying to change the world.
Yeah, and if you look over my shoulder, my television in the living room here, I could spend hours trying to find the most energy efficient television, but ultimately every single one of them is going to end up in landfill somewhere at some point. So as a consumer, to use the term Seb hates so much, there's no good choice I can make. I can only make bad choices. And of course, I could not buy a television and I could watch my TV programs through my laptop or something. But, you know, sometimes you want to watch the action on the big screen. So that's consumer behavior. Let's look at the next one I found, Seb. A term that's often used in relation to circular economy is resource efficiency. For you, is resource efficiency a key part of a circular economy?
Is resource efficiency a key part of the circular economy? Well, I think if we look at this diagram, the emphasis on less. So the idea of how do we use less resources? The problem with that, which you've already kind of talked about in relation to the Inge quote, is what you're going to use less of nothing eventually. We're still going to run out that way. So we're only talking in resource efficiency. We're talking about how do we do less, and again, the challenge we have is, are we looking to make things as efficient as possible? Because in many ways, that's still a linear economy agenda. How do we make this waste system as efficient as possible? Or are we trying to create something that's really effective, which is what we're talking about with the circular economy, and we'll probably dive into that in more detail later.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one because we have quite a few images to get through. Now, top point.
Is this an image of, Colin?
Well, I was just about to ask in the chat window, who knows what this is an image of? I've seen it a handful of times because of our work, and I wonder if anyone's popped it into the chat window.
We've got some industrial symbiosis, some Kallenborg symbiosis, so people know.
They do know, yeah. So, and is there a more famous example of industrial ecology than the Kallenborg Industrial Park? I'm not sure there is, because it's the one I always hear people talk about when they talk about industrial symbiosis. So top points to everyone who spotted it there and knew what this was instantly. And for anyone who doesn't know, the idea here is that one business's waste connects to another business's resource need in a very clever way. And I guess they select businesses to be part of this park in such a way so that there can be all of these mutual benefits and sharing. But is it circular economy? I'm not so sure. I think it certainly has elements of it. It certainly has the spirit of the circular economy within it, because after all, what they're doing here is designing waste out of a system. But I suspect there are, well, in fact, I know there are many sides to the circular economy that are missing from industrial symbiosis, and probably vice versa as well, such as the regeneration of the planet. And I also wonder what happens if a business changes the way it operates, or finds that it needs a different material selection, for example. Does that render many of the different inputs in here useless?
It's a complex network, although quite an impressive example. I suppose the other thing about Kallenborg is it's true to say that you don't find many other examples of it in process, although I've not actually visited it before, so I'm sure it's an interesting example of businesses being able to take advantage of each other's waste streams and to therefore cut out waste.
Okay, on to the next one, Seb. This is for you.
We're beginning it with the Kallenborg symbiosis to talk about some images and representations of things that are becoming circular-ish, I suppose. And this diagram here also fits into that. And what's quite interesting about this diagram is it talks about a loop, and it's thinking circular, and it's got lots of elements of circularness in it, in the sense that it's talking about design, which is very good, with that importance about the intention of design differently in the system to start with. It looks at remanufacturing. It looks at repair and reuse there. What's quite interesting about it, I think, is how much emphasis it places on recycling, as if recycling is this big, massive chunk of the pie. Maybe about a third of the whole pie is recycling, which is different from some of the other images that we advocate, and is perhaps a key tenet of sustainability, is this idea that we're going to recycle our way out of this. When we look deeply in the circular economy for this program, many of you will be aware of this already. The greatest business and economic opportunities, and often the greatest opportunities for avoiding waste and for all the environmental benefits as well, sit within the sphere of new business models and fundamentally different designs. This kind of suggests we need to increase recycling by a lot.
And yeah, I wish I'd made a note actually of where this image had come from, because there must be some reason why recycling is so incredibly prominent on this picture. But also what this image suggests is that there's an inevitable flow where you have to go to recycling after that point of collection. And I think there's a lot more subtlety in the way in which materials, products, and components would flow through the economic system.
See a couple of the comments in the chat picking up on the notion that recycling requires a lot more energy input and other materials and chemicals often. Well, obviously things like reuse, you know, they hold that original product value much more strongly. And we'll definitely be talking about that in more detail as we move through these visualizations of the circular economy.
Recycling validates waste. Great point. Someone just come up with there. And there's lots of critiques of recycling and where recycling facilities are sometimes located as well, which helps validate excessive consumption.
I love the cohort on this program already.
Okay, next slide is actually the same slide because I duplicated it by mistake. So the next, the next image actually comes from Wikipedia, which is, I guess, brings back to my mind all those warnings teachers gave me years ago of not believing everything you see in Wikipedia, because I really dislike this image. And for a couple of good reasons. I think on the left, what we're supposed to see there is a linear economy, and it's not represented by a line. That's a big old curve. So partly because of that. But secondly, there we have it on the right side again, a very simplistic, not that I'm against things being simplistic, because simple can make things very clear sometimes. But here, I don't think so. Because again, we have recycle as one of the loops, and it's not always the case we recycle things. So I find this a curious image to be in such a prominent position.
Yeah, just one loop, and we'll talk a bit about that in more detail as well. This notion that actually is this one continuous cycle that these things follow on from each other, and again, recycling is the inevitable endpoint before we make again, which isn't how we see the circular economy.
But I think it's worth saying this. Recycling is very prominent in many of these images. I think it was quite prominent in the word cloud too. And one thing that you and I have learned over the years of working in this job is people use the term recycling to mean a whole host of different activities, and including reuse and repairing things. And we'll talk about remanufacturing later as well. And I suppose that brings us back to something you discussed earlier, which is the language that we use can be really powerful and can help shape the way in which people think about some of these ideas, some of these systems around us.
I see some people in the chat talking about that some of the business models are missing from this. Someone mentioning sharing and design. Design is missing. This sort of implies that there's not really an adjustment needed to design differently. We talk about at the foundation, we talk about 3 principles of a circular economy, one of which is to keep products and materials in use. And I think that's an important thing to illustrate in our diagrams.
Okay, the next one, when I first saw it, I thought, I know that, this is one of our images, but on a closer inspection, it isn't. What's your comments on this one, Seb?
So I think one of the things I like in the last 2 diagrams, that juxtaposition of linear and circular, it's a key way of explaining what the circular economy is, to try and define what linear is. And in some ways, I think sometimes we forget how profound it is to describe the economy as take, make, waste, because it's something that's immediately recognizable. When someone first told me the current economy works by taking stuff out of the ground, making things out of it, and eventually that becomes waste, it immediately appealed to me and made sense to me. And yet it's not something I'd ever really considered before. And so I think that kind of analysis of the current economy is very powerful for helping for us to show and explain what the circular economy is. But when we look onto the circular side, once again, we've really built it. This diagram is really built around the notion of recycling. Everything's going into the recycling bin as kind of the implication here. And then out of that bin, it gets made again. Maybe it's similar to the previous diagram, trying to focus on simplifying the story, but it doesn't suggest to me, it's not as intuitively true to me as the diagram on the left, and therefore almost feels like a weaker example.
And here is the image that we created some time ago, and surely the one we just saw was influenced by this. There's quite a lot artistically that's similar. And there you can see on the right-hand side, the two loops that Seb was just talking about. And what we call the technical loop, this one on the right-hand side, the terms we use are make, use, and return, as opposed to make, recycle, return. I can't remember actually. How do I go back? There it is. Make, use, recycle. Make, use, return is the terminology that we use. And there are two loops there. And a few people had referred to cradle before in the word cloud. So they'll recognize those two loops. And we at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, our work has definitely been influenced by cradle to cradle. So you'll recognize the two loops of the cradle to cradle here. One's for biological materials, one's for technical materials. And a key point at the bottom there, in a circular economy, ultimately energy should come from renewable sources, because after all, fossil fuels are of course finite too. But all this talk of recycling, Seb, brings us to this next picture here, which has done the rounds in social media quite a lot. And I know you like this picture.
It's really nice. It's a really nice illustration. Again, it's a simplification that helps to explain the point. And I've seen a few comments saying circular economy is not a recycling economy. Maybe they had this image in their minds when they were saying that. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to say that recycling kind of puts a little bit of a delay on things becoming waste. I think there's a couple of things about this diagram that still need development, in the sense that we're still defining circular economy in relation to a bin, which doesn't necessarily talk about all the other benefits, the business benefits, the design benefits, the innovation that's attached to circular economy. It kind of puts it in this box of it's a waste agenda. We're just trying to tackle the problem of waste here, which fundamentally doesn't speak about things like finite material extraction, doesn't speak about the challenges that are caused by this really hyper-efficient take-make-waste economy that runs across the globe, and the business opportunities related to moving towards a circular economy. I do like that, that definition between this is linear, this is recycling, this is circular, helps to provide meaning to diagrams and visualizations like this.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful image with those reservations of the bin being there, but I think it certainly has helped people to better grasp what a circular economy is all about. And I quite frequently hear people talk about a circular innovation, which fits quite comfortably into the middle of these diagrams here as a diversion or a delay rather from the bin. Sometimes you hear some ideas that are branded circular, but really they're more of a recycling economy in the parlance of this graphic. The next picture here I want to talk about, obviously we have a gentleman in a business suit pushing the planet around an infinity loop. You really typically see a lot of images where this type of thing's going on, or someone is cupping the planet in their hands. They're very popular and very strong, bold images to use, but I don't like them in relation to circular economy. I think it paints the wrong picture of what this is all about. My position on this is that the planet is fine. I mean, I think the argument here is we have to save the world, and we see that type of language quite frequently, but the world is actually fine. The world is a complex dynamic system, which of course we're playing our part in altering in some way, but actually the planet doesn't need any saving. I think it's our actions that do need to have some change, but because of the complexities of our planetary systems, which we'll look at in just a few seconds, sometimes our actions are quite unrelated to the outcomes that we see. There can be in natural systems or in systems thinking, there can be a large delay between action and consequence, which is a rather garbled way of getting to this point that I don't think we hold the planet in our hands, because there's much more to the story than that. And Seb, you wanted to talk here about your favorite example in living systems, something that gives you some inspiration.
I was going to say, were you talking about my moss behind me for a minute? This is a story from Michael Braungart. I think this an image is from Cherry Tree Blossoms, and the story that Michael Braungart, one of the sort of co-authors of the Cradle to Cradle book, for those of you who are not familiar with him, is you could look at an image like this and see all the cherry blossom on the ground, and think to yourself that there's a lot of waste. And in many ways, it is quite wasteful. Not all, very small percentage of cherry blossom turns into new cherry trees, but it's actually abundance to feed the system. And that feeding of the system also enriches the soil, which allows the trees to grow and so on. And so it's this idea of thinking about waste differently within nature, by taking inspiration from nature, that can maybe make some of the previous diagrams we've looked at, where we're talking only about just killing off waste outputs, just make us rethink that somewhat in the context of how nature does it. There is no waste in nature, as Browngold would say. Waste is just food for something else.
Following on, so Browngold and McDonough, of course, cradle to cradle, again, we take a lot of inspiration from this, and the circular economy is certainly inspired by the concept of living systems. And beyond the pretty picture of the cherry blossom tree, I'm sure we've all sat in a geography class where a teacher has talked through the global water cycle, as it's called here, the hydrological cycle, former geography teacher, thank you very much, showing us that there are lots of cyclical patterns in nature. And of course, this is a simplification of that. And indeed, the circular economy isn't actually circular. It takes many different shapes, but we like to use the term circular because it is a simplification. But all natural systems are cyclical ultimately. And I guess this picture is just drawing that out and showing us something we all knew anyway. And I think for me, that's one of the appeals of the circular economy. We all understand how natural systems work. We get how they operate, and we appreciate that, you know, they've operated for 4.5 billion years very successfully. So there's something there that we can take from these, something we can learn from them.
I found out just today, Colin, that both you and Clem, who we're going to hear from later, are former geography students.
Well, they do say geography students are the best.
Do they?
Now, you really wanted this picture in here, Seb.
I know. I had to fight you quite hard to let me show this, and might run over because of my desperation to talk about this. This is an image that will probably come up again later in the series from one of our guests, Ken Webster. But what I like about it is it begins to add in some of the complexity and different stories that some of the other diagrams haven't had. So, for example, on the linear side, it talks about waste across the system. It talks about the role of money. It talks about a system powered by fossil fuels. And on the right-hand side, it talks about renewable energy. It asks the question of what role money has in this system, which we'll dig into in some of the later webinars. But it also talks about the technical and biological cycles being fundamentally different cycles. You've got the man-made materials, the human-made materials are fundamentally different in terms of how they cycle and how they work in a circular economy to the biological side. So there's some nuance to this visualization, very nicely designed visualization that I appreciate.
In just a minute, we're going to go to Clem, who's been gathering a few comments and has got a question to put to us as well, Seb. Before we go there, we'll share with you one final image, and it's an image that we use a lot at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, called the butterfly diagram. And we'll talk a little bit about this later as well, actually. I just want to take you back to a point we made earlier, which is to say, there's no right or wrong way of defining what a circular economy is or describing how it operates. You may, so you're absolutely welcome to disagree with us. And this is simply the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's visualization of it. And it's our most detailed visualization of it, and probably our most shared one as well. But that's not to say it's not without its criticisms. For example, one of the biggest criticisms we tend to get is that people appear to be missing from here. Of course, there are consumers and users right there in the center. But what are the impacts on people is a question that we get asked a lot. And I've noticed in the chat window, as I've had a quick scroll through, that that's been a recurring theme as well that people have talked about. And that's something we'll talk about as the 7 weeks go on. But this is what we call our butterfly diagram. It captures a circular economy, but as I said before, it's not circular. It contains lots of different loops. And it's so therefore those simplifications we saw before, where everything had to flow in a particular direction, we would say ultimately we disagree with it. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And it's actually a lot more nuanced than this diagram. But this is a simplification of what is a complex system. Seb, are you prepared to hear what Clem's got for us from the audience?
I can't wait to hear what the audience has been saying.
Well, and Clem, where are you?
I'm here. I've just joined. Yes, well, the chat is very, very busy. Thank you, everyone who's been posting comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A. The geographers are waking up. There's a lot of them in there. So nice to see so many people in there. To come back to one of the first images you showed about the ENG comment, most people agreed that this sentence wasn't reflecting, the circular economy. And actually, Charlotte commented something that I really liked, which is that we should do more good, not less bad. It's something that we also tend to say quite a bit. And Jan also commented that we should go as far as to try to regenerate the natural systems, which is also something we say quite a bit, and you will hear us say that a lot over the next 7 weeks. We also had a very interesting comment about waste, which was that Marmite uses waste yeast from beer production, which I think is always super interesting to know. I did not know that. Did you know that, Colin?
I heard it. I couldn't describe it all to you, but I've heard that tale before, yeah.
Do you like Marmite?
I hate it.
What about you, Seb? You're muted.
I don't mind it.
Okay. All right.
Only
Well,
because I refuse to love or hate it.
okay. I don't think I've ever tried it, actually. So I think maybe I'll do that later after the webinar. And finally, there was a very interesting question about from Linda in the Q&A. Linda asks, does the circular economy directly contradict capitalism? So I don't know who wants to tackle that question.
Does the circular economy contradict capitalism? I don't think it does. My take on it is, in fact, some people criticize the circular economy because it allows businesses to continue operating, obviously not in a planetary destructive way, but doesn't necessarily address, in the eyes of the critics, the idea of consumerism. So some people would strongly disagree with the idea that it contradicts capitalism. What's your take on it, Seb?
I think one of the things about that is it depends on what you define as capitalism. I think and that's one of those quite tricky terms that isn't necessary. But what I would say about the circle is it very clearly welcomes enterprise. It very clearly welcomes business innovation, and it's very strongly promoted and advertised as a business opportunity. It's about looking at the rules of the game as well to think about, well, how does the system work? How do we still have enterprise, business innovation, people making money in a way that that delivers a whole range of benefits and works within the ecosystem that we have.
There's also the argument, and I know Ken Webster, who we'll hear from in an upcoming webinar, he doesn't entertain discussion about, is it a capitalist, is it socialist? He thinks these are outdated terms, and instead we should be concentrating on what is, after all, a super idea, the circular economy, regenerative by design, but not necessarily distributive in the ways in which we've seen it so far, but it is a goal of the Ellen MacArthur Foundations and it is a goal of many in the movement of circular economy, that the circular economy should be more distributive and financially speaking. And I think a lot of the time when I think of capitalism, I think of wealth inequalities, and we need to find a way in which money doesn't become, how is it Ken puts it actually? He talks about it, I wanted to say constipated in the flow, but it's something along those lines. That seems apt to talk about that once we've been chatting about Marmite.
Yeah, well, I hope Linda is happy with that answer. We'll see what she says.
A great discussion
and also,
point.
We started a whole new conversation, a whole new debate, Marmite versus Vegemite. So I think maybe we'll keep that for later.
Well, we didn't put that on the Mentimeter poll, but we do have another Mentimeter poll for you right now. You ready for that, Seb?
I'm completely ready. If you are still open on Mentimeter, it will probably prompt you to move to the next slide, but I believe you can also put the details up once again, Colin. This time, the next prompt you should receive is, in a word, and we've started to touch on it maybe, what has been missing from our conversation so far? So either allow that slide to change or indeed follow the details on the screen. Obviously, we've just been talking about capitalism and people. So there's a few things cropping up. I see. Just going to give it a few more moments, but yes, indeed, in the chat, many of those issues have been raised. Someone I think responded to me to say that capitalism means capitalism. True. Can't really argue with that question. And a few people mentioning Kate Rayworth's donut economics is another take on this. And Kate is actually featuring on the Foundation's Circular Economy show next week and has featured in many of our other events to talk about her notion of donut economics, which is a really strong intertwined theory with the circular economy. So we love Kate's work.
And we'll have a video of Kate as one of the video pieces at some point along this program.
Here's the word cloud that you've all been building. As you can see, people right at the heart of that. Interestingly, design, probably missing from many of the diagrams that we were looking at in that piece there. Climate change.
Examples, business models.
Climate change is a topic we'll definitely dig into. Growth, perhaps linked a little bit to some of the things we were talking about with capitalism just now. What does a circle mean to have growth? And again, I think we've got some content over the 7 weeks that will respond to that question.
Well, yes, I guess we're not too surprised to see some of the results here. We've barely talked about people and social, other than to say we don't talk about it too often enough. So it's not a surprise to see that right in the middle. But some of the other points, those that I can read anyway, because some of the text is very small, we're about to talk about those as we go through the remainder of the webinar. Do we have another Mentimeter right now, Seb?
Yes, we do, Colin. Yes, we do. Let me work my magic. That's not too strong of a word. So you should be prompted at this point again to answer the question, what matters most? Which will tease between the two options are capturing people's attention with stories and visualizations. We've been talking about stories and visualizations quite a bit, or demonstrating the financial benefits. So what matters most? Again, it should be prompted on the Mentimeter screen to switch to next slide. And Amanda, yes, of course we want to say both, but this is deliberately making you choose, and that's the game. That's the game we play. Let's highlight the results of this one, as we've got a pretty good split actually, really. Seems we've got people equally value both. And of course, it's a little bit of a trick question because there's hard to argue that they're each extremely important. We understand that businesses need to see that financial benefit, and indeed policymakers and other key stakeholders need to see that economic benefit to transition. That's slightly winning. But very often that also comes with this idea of what's this, as you were just talking about, Ken, what's this big idea? What's the story? We're so strongly influenced by the ideas and stories and the narratives that we experience. It's quite hard to separate that from what we consider to be a really good economic or business or high level decision-making opportunity.
I wonder if anyone has this book here, Story Wars, which I've been working my way through, which picks up on that point exactly. That's by Jonah Sachs, incidentally, Story Wars, if anyone's interested in that, who I think was somehow behind the Story of Stuff, or involved in the Story of Stuff, which I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of people here. And of course, the argument in that book is that the greatest stories are going to win the day. So I'm more on the right-hand side here, capturing people's attention with stories, with metaphors as well. We talked about metaphors a little bit, and visualizations, because I think the circular economy, when it comes down to it, we need to change the way we think about how our economy can work. And the way we do that is through stories and visualizations. And then what comes next is proving the case economically, and convincing people, policymakers, as well as businesses, that change needs to happen.
And I think what we ultimately think of ourselves as people is as rational decision-making machines, but the reality is very different. I mean, our brains are processing a ridiculous amount of information every single hour, every single minute, every single day. And so the way in which we do that is we build frames, and it's amazing how little time we spend deliberately thinking about things. And I've been reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow recently, so I'm probably heavily influenced by that. But this idea that we're spending a lot of time in an analytical thinking mode is kind of been disproven by the research, and therefore what we associate to a term like circular economy and what stories we build off it are huge motivators for the decisions we make. And thinking about some of these historical bases, we are very heavily influenced by how we see things in the present and what frames we attach to them. So why maybe some of the things that we've been talking about in the world of visualizations almost can seem a bit finicky. What we associate to visually and by words to the circular economy will very strongly influence the actions that we end up taking.
Fascinating. A lot of equally fascinating comments come out in the chat window. I actually have to turn it off from time to time because it can be a bit distracting because the speed of which the messages go by. But they will not be going by our colleague Clem, who will come to later on, and she'll pick up on a few observations that she's seen there. Seb, just to go back quickly to those visualizations we saw before, people said design perhaps is something we haven't discussed, but of course we do think design is a key. In fact, perhaps the first, well, after mindset, let's call it in the second step.
Sorry, say that again, Colin.
We believe that design comes after mindset.
Yeah, so that I think it's absolutely crucial to say that what we're talking about here is designing things differently from the outset. We're not talking about looking at the outcomes of the current economy and trying to figure out how we can do less bad or how we can deal with this waste. And I think it's a very natural thing to do. Many of us will look at the negatives of that take, make, waste system and say, well, what are we going to do with all this waste then? And fundamentally, that's not what we're doing with the circular economy. We're saying from the outset, how do we design this differently? And that can be done at a product level. How do we design this product differently? Or how do we design this whole system differently?
And so let's quickly talk through one example, and time is rattling on, so we don't have much time, but we thought we'd illustrate the circular economy with a quick example for you. And it's the example of mobile phones. Now, many of you, well, we've all got a mobile phone, and perhaps you've been using it for Mentimeter a year. I like this diagram on the left-hand side about how half the periodic table being in your mobile phone. So a few stats down the right-hand side that won't be a surprise to anybody when it comes to mobile phones: frequency of use and disposal. And of course, it's not just disposal. In a landfill, quite often those old mobile phones are sitting in our drawers or similar. But we wanted to talk through what a circular economy for mobile phones could look like, starting off by looking at the status quo. But this does come with a little footnote, which is to say this is based on 2010 data in the EU, and actually it's not based on smartphones, it's based on phones that look a bit like that diagram there, I guess, Nokia's in particular, so I suppose we all had back in that day. So here is, well, actually this is not the current scenario, this is what we see as a transitional scenario. Seb, do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, so what we're doing there is what the report did was it broke down the butterfly diagram for one particular product. So maybe some of the people in this webinar would have previously had their phones repaired in some way, and they may have gone to a local repair shop, or even actually looked online at iFixit's catalog of repairs and repaired their phone, or they may have gone back to the Apple shop and had that done by the brand itself. And so what this diagram does, it sort of looks at, or what this scenario did is it looked at what are the different opportunities for a mobile phone. And the first one I've just talked through there is maintenance, this idea of what can be done to actually repair a phone. And then it looked at what are the opportunities to reuse it. And so what you see in this diagram is that when you do a repair, it kind of stays with the same user. The next flow is a reuse where the phone maybe goes back to a service provider and then is distributed to some other user. So maybe some of the people have got, I see a lot of people mentioning Fairphone in the chat, which is a great example of innovation in the phone, but maybe some people have bought second-hand phones or indeed sold their phones second-hand. The next loop is remanufacture. So this idea of actually we're not taking this whole phone out apart, but we're actually remanufacturing it to an as new condition by either remanufacturing particular parts or using different parts in a way. And so that actually just goes back to the product manufacturer. And so this what this loop down the middle is, I didn't really clarify that, is it's showing the linear cycle of a phone where we take some things out of the ground, we make parts out of them, put them into a product, goes to a provider and ends up in a user's hand. And then the final cycle, of course, is that so much of the phone parts could potentially be recycled back into new parts eventually. What our analysis showed is that in a transitional scenario where, and the numbers there represent percentages, so even in a transitional scenario where still 50% of the phone is not being utilized, there could be some significant benefits, including 1.3 million tons of carbon being saved, and I think about a $1 billion US benefit as well. And so the greatest value that's being extracted here is in these innermost loops, because, and we had this sort of a few comments about this, because that's where the most embedded energy and labor value is being retained. So maintaining your phone, repairing your phone, reusing it, remanufacturing, all require less energy, less labor than recycling.
And the current scenario, just to remind people, so what we're seeing here, the 50 at the bottom is 50% of phones in a transitional scenario still going to landfill, but the status quo was 85%. So this is a significant change, which brings about significant financial and environmental benefits, as Seb has pointed out. But the key to it all is design. So the way in which we design the product so that it can be maintained, so it can be remanufactured. The way we design the systems, so there are collection systems and harvesting systems, so that there can be some pre-sorting of old mobile phones before they go for remanufacture or recycle. And the redesign of business models that go hand in hand with this, that make it attractive for people to return their phones so that they can be reused.
And the Fairphone example is a great example of this. I know we're time, Colin, but the Fairphone, they've specifically designed that phone to make it more repairable, to make it more modular, to make it last longer, or certain parts to last longer. And I want to pick up on a comment that came in from, I've lost track of who actually sent it in, who said, you know, people need to be more aware and we buy too many phones. But I think that's going down the route that I was talking about earlier of saying, no, it's our fault. We're buying too many phones. But what Fairphone is saying is, you can have a new phone or an upgraded phone every 3 or 4 years. We just want that phone back off you at the end, so that we can reuse the parts, that we can manufacture the materials, and so we don't have to make a brand new phone every single time. It doesn't get lost in the system.
So that's what we call the transitional scenario. And our analysis of this report said, well, what if you go a step further? What if we tighten that design even further to such an extent that we capture almost all of the phones? And this is what we call the advanced scenario. And you might see it's missing the recycling loop altogether. 5% of phones are going to landfill in this advanced scenario, because I saw this in the comments too. It's naive to think there'll be no waste. Of course, there will be waste, there will be leakage in the system, and there will be in this advanced scenario too. But what's happening here, because of the change of design, because of the change in business models, 50% can go through reuse, 50% through remanufacture, thereabouts. You can tell the numbers don't quite add up to 100. But what this brings about are material savings of about $2 billion per annum, energy savings of about $160 million per annum, and greenhouse gas savings of 3 million tons annually of CO2. And that's just in the EU area only. So these savings are pretty significant. They do add up pretty quickly. So that was a quick look at one example, and I know it's been a very brief run through of an example of the circular economy in action. And of course, it was just a run through of the right-hand side of the diagram here, the technical cycle of the circular economy. We will, in future sessions in this program be looking at the biological cycle and talk about that in more detail. But just very briefly, Seb, that it is a different beast, isn't it, the biological cycle?
The biological cycle operates fundamentally differently. On the left, on that right-hand side of the technical cycle, you've got quite short, tight, relatively short use phases. Even if it's 10 to 50 years, that's relatively short in the lifespan of materials and products and the biological cycle. On the left-hand side, you've got these big, long processes like you were showing us with your hydrological cycle, your geography diagram you were showing us earlier. So it's less explored, it's being more explored. We will be doing a deep dive on food, for example, at one stage where there's significant increasing understanding, but it works in much longer natural cycles. And so it's a bit of a different animal, but also very rich with opportunity and abundance.
So that was a very brief and perhaps an all too brief look at the loops of the circular economy and one example of it. Seb, have we got time to jump to one more opinion poll?
I think it would be really awful not to. So hopefully you're being prompted now to, if you haven't already, to look at ranking these statements on Mentimeter in order. So we've got when designing a circular economy, what matters most, how we design products and services, how consumers shop and behave, that citizens understand the circular economy, demonstrable examples of the circular action, and subsidies that benefit circular, discourage linear. So I'll give a few more people a chance to do that. Remember, it's www.menti.com and the code is 1371442, 1371442. And we'll see what you think in terms of a priority rating. And I wonder, it's fascinating to watch this live, Colin. You're missing out massively to see the jiggling about of priority orders. Here's the ranking, and I can see that I feel like I know you've said quite a few times in this webinar, Colin, that there's no wrong answers. I completely disagree with that. I'm always giving the right answers, and I feel like one of the things that we've tried to emphasize in the course of this webinar is that real importance of designing things differently from the start. It was also called out in some of the other word clouds, and it appears to have won this poll by quite a significant margin, even though there are clearly some people who disagree with some of my bemoaning of consumer behavior change being prioritized.
What would be your 1 to 5 here, Seb?
I think I completely agree with number one in terms of the designing products and services very differently is very important. I think I would probably go number 2 as examples of circular economy in action, because I think there's something, it comes back to that storytelling. There's something so powerful about seeing what this is really that allows others to emulate and copy. And my third one would be subsidies. The role of policymakers in enabling that change is still very important. And again, we have one of the webinars in the series that looks at enabling conditions, and we'll be talking about the metaphor of the sandwich that Ken Webster likes so much. This idea that yes, there's the kind of meat and filling in the middle, which is how we design things differently, but we also need to think about the system conditions that sit around that.
Yeah, disappointingly, I have to agree with you. No, yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, no point saying any more. I wonder then, before we say our goodbyes, Clem, have you got a couple more comments for us?
Yes, well, I have one main comment. People have been chatting about different ways we can achieve the circular economy, from design to finance through waste flows. All of these are great to mention, and I do want to just add and highlight that there's 6 more webinars coming up in this series. So today was not at all about answering all of these questions and touching upon all of these, and actually there was a lot of comments about design and redesigning products and redesigning systems, which is exactly what we'll be talking about next week in our webinar focused on design and the business case for a circular economy. So yes, and also Nina asked for more resources and recommendations of things you can listen to, podcasts, videos, all of that. And we will be sharing a lot of these in Slack. So
someone said in the comments, Clem, that you've got the hardest job here. And I think they could be right.
I'm not sure. We'll see.
Tell us about your job on Friday, because next time we're back in action is actually on Friday. We'll be live with you.
Exactly. So every Friday we'll have a recap session to highlight a little bit what we discussed during the webinars, but mostly to engage with you, the audience, to discuss what you answered in the multiple challenges, questions, and discussions we're having on Slack. And it's just a way of talking to each other, not through writing, but to be able to interact a little bit more.
Thanks very much, Clem. And we can see that's there as step 2, isn't it, on what's coming up next. We also have a couple of other things on the list here. So one is a challenge that Clem has set for you. And has that been posted in Slack already, Clem?
It has. It's been posted. It posted a few hours ago. So go check it out.
That's something we'll be discussing on the Friday show with Clem, your responses to that challenge. And then after Friday, the next time we'll see you is on Wednesday, where we'll be talking about design and the business case for a circular economy. We've got a fantastic guest lined up for that show, so we're looking forward to that. But make sure you're involved in the conversation in Slack, where we'll be too, and we'll be getting in there just as much as you. So thanks very much for being a part of this show. Thanks to you, Seb.
Thank you, Colin. You're very welcome.